We'll finish this third lecture on informal fallacies and our discussion about informal fallacies in the class generally by going from trying to identify patterns in relatively simple, idealized arguments to translating that skill that we're hopefully developing at recognizing different argument patterns, informal fallacy patterns, to our argument and information exchange in everyday, ordinary life. So when we're trying to detect fallacies out there in the world, there are a number of things that we're going to notice right away. One thing is, in arguments in ordinary language, in ordinary life, whether they're written arguments or verbal arguments, they tend not to be in perfect standard form. That is, the premise may start the argument, then there's a conclusion, then there's another premise. So they may be out of conventional order. They may include extraneous information. There may be information that isn't expressed. And so all the problems that we found when we were trying to identify passages, written or verbal passages that contained arguments in that arguments chapter, are problems that will arise in thinking about our informal fallacies. In addition to that, when people present an informal fallacy, sometimes they're deliberately intending to do so, but many times they're not trying to craft the perfect informal fallacy. And so the patterns that we're learning to recognize may not be perfectly represented in the examples that we see out in the real world. Moreover, people may actually have more than one fallacy that they commit in a single argument. So we need to be aware of this. So we need to focus in on what's our conclusion and what are our premises and what's the relationship between them. So if we see a lot of emotionally elated language, we ought to think to ourselves, okay, this looks like a schema distortion case. This looks like a case where we're thinking about a problem having to do with getting along socially or avoiding risk or harm, instead of thinking about a problem involving forming a correct belief or making an appropriate choice. And so we want to be careful when we're going through and trying to detect fallacies, whether it's in these more artificial practice problems and exams, or whether it's in everyday life. Now, other things that get mentioned, for instance, are people's normal habits. And oftentimes people are accused of being sort of intellectually slothful, not paying very much attention. I think that a lot of this actually has to do with those system resource limitations. Our working memory is small. And so when we're consuming information, we're not running a sort of meta level evaluation of the source of information that we're receiving, looking really hard, constantly trying to detect informal fallacies. And so in many ways, right, we're going to find it difficult to be very facile in our ordinary life and detecting informal fallacies if we're not paying attention to that circumstance where it's suggesting to us that an argument is going to be given or that that argument might even be an informal fallacy. But nevertheless, the more we cultivate the habit of thinking about our exchanges with people in terms of whether or not they're arguments and whether or not those arguments are in fact good arguments or informal fallacies, the more that we do that, the more we'll cultivate the habit of processing information in a way that at least gives us a better chance of identifying those things. So we can change our habits. We can change our habits in ways that will at least help us avoid limitations in our working memory, for example. Right? And because we're now aware of these patterns, and because we have some facility at identifying, oh, this is an argument against the person, oh, this is a begging the question argument, oh, this is a red herring, then what we'll find is that level of awareness can kick in whenever the situation cues us to suggest there's an argument or perhaps there's an informal fallacy. And so we will improve even our ordinary life, though that improvement may not be as dramatic as we'd like. When it comes to avoiding fallacies, that is, not creating and offering up fallacies in defense of our own views, or using them to justify our inferences or make our own choices. Right? Hurley identifies sort of three sources of informal fallacies in his mind. The first one is just a lack of vigilance. And his idea here, again, I think relates to our limited working memory. When we're thinking about an argument, we're marshaling our resources, we're not at the same time always running that background detection algorithm that says, hey, am I engaging in confirmation bias or cherry picking? Am I making sure that the argument that I give is an argument that doesn't beg the question, and so on. And so we do have to be vigilant, particularly when we're consciously and deliberately crafting our arguments. It can become doubly hard if we've got an emotional or an ideological bias. And so Hurley talks about how when we have an emotional connection to an idea, we are less critical of that idea. And this is definitely the case. Right? We saw belief bias when we looked at inference patterns and human inference abilities in the inference section. If we're disposed to believe something, if it's important to us emotionally or important to us normatively, then we tend to have a bias about it. And likewise, our worldview, right, insofar as our worldview contains biases, may bias us for or against a particular viewpoint, may make us less critical or less careful in formulating our own arguments and presenting them to other people, or in consuming arguments of other people and evaluating them for whether or not they provide us with good reasons to believe something. The other problem that we're going to find in avoiding fallacies, both avoiding fallacies that other people are sending our way, and even avoiding fallacies that we may commit, is this idea of a deliberate action for gain. So sometimes, even though they don't intend to, and of course many times because they intend to, people will give an argument that is an informal fallacy. We're less critical of arguments that support our views, more critical of arguments that run contrary to our views. We want to use our arguments to convince people, and sometimes people aren't scrupulous about how they convince people. Right? So, for instance, many of the informal fallacies that Aristotle identified were fallacies that he marked from the way in which the Athenian democracy worked, so that people were out there being trained to convince people, not because their view was right, but because that's what they wanted people to believe, and convince them by any means. And so when we think about committing informal fallacies, we really have to, when we look at our own behaviors, we have to realize that if we deliberately employ fallacious arguments like this, that's at least as immoral as lying to people. It may even be worse, because when we're lying to people, we're just saying something that's not true in order to get some advantage or to avoid some problem. But when we're engaging in employing an informal fallacy, what we're really trying to do is exploit somebody's weaknesses to get a benefit, exploit somebody's weaknesses to gain advantage. So it's sort of like, kicking people when they're down, finding their weak spots and exploiting their weak spots for your own gain. And so in this way, I think it's almost worse than just something like lying to people.